Introduction. I was 15 when I followed the army, and 40 when I returned. I met a man from my own village, and asked him, "Who will I find at home?" "Your house is that ruin over there, overgrown and deserted." I found rabbits running in through a hole, and pheasants were roosting in the roof. Anon, ancient poem, c. AD 200. When civil war rages, virtue is forgotten. When mighty men tear apart a country, they carve their own kingdoms from the ruins. This poem, written at the end of the Han Dynasty, is a lament for the ordinary folk whose lives are broken by violence and the collapse of government, and whose voices we rarely hear in official histories. The Romance of the Three Kingdoms tells of this same collapse in the form of an epic novel. It is set historically in the time of the disintegration of the Han Dynasty, from around AD 168 to 280, though written 1,000 years later. Most of the key events described in the book actually happened. The murder of emperors and empresses, the betrayal of loyal advisors, the breakdown of central government, the burning of a great, historic capital city, the many battles, all these took place. They were recorded in the official history of the period, primarily written and compiled at the very end of the 3rd century AD. But while the true events form the skeleton of the book, its beating heart is the epic retelling of the story with heroes and heroines, scoundrels and betrayers. This was done initially by the oral storytellers of folk legend and drama, and much later by a novelist, who wove it all together into this book and whose identity is still debated. To the people and dynasties that came later, the fall of the Han and the rise of the Three Kingdoms from its ashes became a classic symbol of dynastic decay and collapse. Previous dynasties had fallen, of course either overthrown, like the Shang in the 11th century BC, or gradually failing, like the Zhou, whose empire founded in the same century eventually fell into feuding kingdoms. By the Warring States period from the 5th century BC, the pretense that the Zhou was still the ruling dynasty was maintained even as the actual states, kingdoms in all but name, fought each other for centuries. In the end it was the triumph of the state of Qin that reunited the empire, only for it to fall due to the cruelty of the first emperor, he of the Terracotta Warriors, less than 20 years after he was declared emperor. In 206 BC, Qin was overthrown by the Han. The Han rulers controlled China for over 400 years, punctuated by a brief period in the middle, when a rebel named Wang Mang seized power AD 9 to 25. In roughly the same period, the Roman Republic became the Roman Empire and rose to its greatest height. In many ways the Han was the first fully recorded Chinese dynasty. Earlier periods of Chinese rule, including the Shang and the Zhou, are half hidden in myths, legends and magic, which swirled around the key historical facts available from inscriptions, tombs and annals. But the Han is as fully recorded as any later dynasty, and for many Chinese it stands as the model of what a dynasty should be. This is why its fall was so traumatic and why it has acted as a warning to successive dynasties and regimes ever since about the failure that so often follows excessive ambition. This is also why poems written about the suffering of the ordinary folk during the Han's collapse, such as the one at the start of this introduction, have been passed down from generation to generation. The fall of the Han has become the archetype of how justice, morality, stability and wisdom can be threatened by greed, plotting administrators, often here in the guise of eunuchs, ambitious women, audacious men, warlords, abuse and extravagance. It has become the key story about the rise and fall of fortunes, about virtue and lack of virtue, about abuse and kindness. Its enduring prominence in the Chinese imagination explains why a novel would seek to tell the story of a dynasty's decline and fall at such great length and why that novel would be so popular. In the centuries following it, the fall of the Han became one of the favorite stories to be retold in the evening around fires or to be acted out at local folk and religious festivals. It provides so many of the larger-than-life characters that make great tyrants and heroes in Chinese opera and folk plays. There's the evil Dong Zhuge, who early on in the novel overthrows the legitimate emperor, places his own candidate on the throne and then subverts his power. There's the hero Zhao Zilong, whose arrival at a battle ensures success because of his outstanding courage, and the heroine Lady Sun, a warrior and then a wife to the most virtuous of the founders of one of the Three Kingdoms. And there are plenty of wickedly scheming courtiers such as Wang Yun, who plots to overthrow Dong Zhuge by setting him against his adopted son Lu Bu but then hastens the collapse of the empire. Alongside these key characters, there are many lesser characters whose betrayals and intrigues bring the people involved to horrible and bloody endings, perfect for dramatic reenactments. Lubu, the period in Chinese history after the Han and after which the novel was named, is called the Three Kingdoms. This is because as China fell apart and into a dark world ruled by warlords and thugs, three key leaders emerged. Each ended up founding his own dynasty, and each carved his own kingdom out of the dying body of Han China. The three were Liu Bei, or Xuanda, which is how I refer to him throughout the book, to distinguish him from all the other Lius, Cao Cao and Sun Quan. Xuanda appears right at the start of the action in Chapter 1, and it is his fortunes that determine the pace and direction of the beginning of the novel. The first description of him is famous in Chinese storytelling. While he is not a scholar, he is a good man, generous, reserved and modest. His greatest aspiration is to befriend the worthiest men of the empire. He is a tall man, with arms that reach down below his knees. He has long earlobes, and his eyes are so wide apart he can actually see his own ears. His face is as pure as jade while his lips are bright red. See here. In the same chapter we are also introduced to two other major characters, the erratic, violent but deeply loyal Zhang Fei and the gallant, much more noble and equally loyal Guanyu. They are each, for different reasons, on their way to offer help to the local governor after a revolt has broken out, when they all meet, by chance, in an inn. Soon afterwards they take one of the most famous vows in Chinese history, known as the Vow of the Peach Orchard, promising to support each other, to defend the people and to seek to die side by side on the same day. From that moment on they are a band of brothers with Xuanda as their leader. Liu Bei, Xuanda, Zhang Fei. In real life Xuanda was declared the emperor of the kingdom of Shu, sometimes called the Shu Han, and tried almost single-handedly to keep the Han Dynasty alive through his own distant links with the imperial family, even though the dynasty had in truth fallen. Xuanda's kingdom was based in Sichuan province in the west of China. His tomb in its capital at Chengdu is still an important place of pilgrimage and veneration to this day. In the novel, almost immediately after having taken their vow, the three brothers in arms come up against the second of the main historic characters, the ambitious, ruthless Cao Cao. A famous story tells of how, when he was young, one of his uncles had complained about his behavior to his father, who punished him. The next time Cao Cao met that uncle he dropped to the ground as if he were having an epileptic fit. Then, when his father was called, Cao Cao told him that nothing had happened at all, but it was just another of the uncle's lies. From then on he got his own way, and the father did not listen to anyone criticizing him. Cao Cao effectively held the real Han Emperor, Xian, the last of the true Han Emperors, under elaborate house arrest and made him his puppet. Cao Cao later took the title of the King of Wei, a reference to the entire northern area of the empire. When he died in 220, his son Cao Pai forced Xian, the last Han Emperor, to abdicate, allowing Cao Pai to become the Emperor of Wei. The exact whereabouts of the burial of Cao Cao remain a matter of controversy. Certainly, he was never accorded the reverence that Xuanda was. Cao Cao, the founder of the Third Kingdom, was Sun Quan. His family had already ruled an area in the south for 3 generations. As the Han Empire fell apart, Sun Quan watched, often from the sidelines, often in uneasy alliances with either Xuanda or Cao Cao. Eventually in 229 he declared himself emperor of the kingdom of Wu in its capital, known today as Nanjing. This kingdom covered the east and south of China and included some of today's Vietnam. A much more shadowy figure in the novel, Sun Quan was renowned for 2 things, his habitual indecision and for being the man who eventually ordered the execution of one of the 3 brothers of the Peach Orchard, Guanyu. In southern China, Sun Quan is still revered, and his tomb is located within the stunning setting of the Ming Xiaoling Park in Nanjing, with its sacred path marked by huge statues of animals, mythological beasts and officials. It is less visited as a place of worship and reverence than the tomb of Xuanda, but the tomb mound is still very visible, and an exhibition hall praises Sun Quan as a model emperor and enlightened ruler. Sun Quan, the other great figure in this story, is the Taoist magician, strategist and official Kong Ming, also known as Zhuge Liang. I have used the former name throughout to distinguish him from the many other Zhuges. He is the most fascinating and enigmatic of all the characters in the novel and, true to form, we first meet him by not meeting him. In the story, Xuanda is advised to seek this Taoist master in order to learn from him. And he tries unsuccessfully time and time again to do so, to the intense annoyance of his peach orchard brother Zhang Fei. When they eventually meet, the die is cast. Kongming not only outlines immediately what course of action Xuande should take but also joins him as his military and civil advisor. The first description of Kongming is famous. When Kongming appears, Xuande is truly impressed because he looks like such a gentleman. He is tall, with a complexion like jade, and is dressed in a long cloak of crane feathers. His head is bound with a silk scarf. To be honest, he looks like a god or an immortal. See here. With Kongming on his side, Xuande moves from being a support character to being the main driver of the narrative along with Cao Cao. And at this point the Three Kingdoms becomes an inevitable consequence of the collapse of the empire. A special shrine dedicated to Kongming is to this day beside that of Xuande and, like that of the man he guided into a position of such power 1,800 years ago, it is still a major focus of reverence, and even worship. His actual tomb near Hanzhong is likewise a place of pilgrimage. What is surprising is that the most visible of all the figures of the Three Kingdoms today is Guanyu, the gallant second member of the Peach Orchard Brotherhood. In the long period since his death in AD 220 he has been elevated to divine status by various emperors. In 1120 he was made the most loyal and faithful duke when the Song dynasty was under dire threat by northern barbarians, and the empire needed a hero who had fought against the northerners before. In 1330 the Mongol emperor, seeking to legitimate the foreign rule of the Mongols over the Chinese, elevated him further with the title warrior prince and civilizer. And then in 1594 the Ming Emperor Wanli made him a god and awarded him the title faithful and loyal great emperor, supporter of heaven and defender of the kingdom. Zhuge Liang, Kongming, today Guanyu's image is everywhere in Chinese culture, for he is both the god of war and the god of literature. He is shown in statues, on posters, in prints with his two supporters and almost always with his faithful horse Red Hare, who died of sadness shortly after his master was executed. Hopeful scholars and schoolchildren pray to him before their exams. In his role as god of literature, and as god of war he has been invoked by just about every commander of Chinese forces since the Ming Dynasty. His temples are among the most common in China and abroad in Chinese communities. Yet he is almost entirely the creation of fiction. Without doubt his towering status is down to the virtuous and loyal starring role he plays in folk stories, dramas, and the romance of the Three Kingdoms. Guanyu. The core historical facts of the fall of the Han are attested in the records of the Han Dynasty, compiled initially in the very late 3rd century but then expanded with much additional material until a final imperially approved record was authorized in 429. Over the succeeding centuries, poets, writers and others called on the lessons from this particular period in the past to shine light on the problems of the present. The Three Kingdoms offered them both poignant images and philosophical lessons in abundance, and many of their responses would later find their way into the romance of the Three Kingdoms. In the Tang Dynasty, AD 618 to 907, poets were acutely aware of the historic events of the Three Kingdoms and of their great moral and spiritual significance. The major 8th century poet Du Fu, AD 712 to 70, for example, wrote of visiting the tomb of Kongming in Chengdu and brilliantly described the breakup of an empire. His poem, reflecting on the death of Kongming, which is included in chapter 105, is a key moment in the novel. Where can I find the Prime Minister's shrine? Beyond the town where the cypresses stand vertical. Here's sunlit, lush grass, a perpetual spring. Orioles sing in the branches, but who to? 3 times his lord had to beg him to help the kingdom. He served 2 terms with all his heart, but died with all his plans unrealized. And ever since, truly heroic men weep at his death. Kongming's illustrious name is known worldwide. Highest among the high, famed for his kingly mien. 3 kingdoms split into being, he used all his skill. One pointed as a feather, to reunite them again. His reputation as great as the legendary ones. Even in his failures, he still ranks among the greatest. The stars turned. The Han were fated to fall. Working to the end, his body scarred, he never gave up. The 9th century poet Heizing wrote about Kongming's most famous military exploit, in which he pardoned the tribal leader of the Man people, Menghua, 7 times, a central story in the later chapters of the novel. His verse is reproduced in chapter 88. For 5 months on campaign in this desolate land, going by moonlight to the river of deadly mists. His outstanding audacity more than justifies the 3 visits. And yet despite his attacks on the man, liberty is given 7 times. Du Fu was writing in the mid-8th century, when a major revolt had nearly toppled the Tang dynasty, and He Xing was writing as the dynasty fell, in the years running up to 907. Bad times on both occasions increased interest and reflection on the lessons to be learned from the fall of the Han and the rise of 3 kingdoms. Once the Tang had fallen, a period of anarchy erupted, followed in 960 by the Song. The new dynasty faced huge challenges, not least from the north and from barbarian tribes. In this era, the famous poet Su Dongpa, 1037–1121, wrote of one of Xuanda's famous exploits, a dramatic escape from his enemies on a horse that leaped a raging river, told in chapter 34. I'm growing old, the leaves drift from the trees. I journey, on official business, by the Tan River. Halting my carriage, I get out and walk beside it. Catkins glisten, stirred by the wind. I see the dying virtue of the great Yang. How dragon fought tiger, and tiger, dragon. At Xiangyang, the nobles gathered round their king. And among them, Xuanda, as if doomed to die. But he rides for his life out of the western gate. Escaping, but as soon, pursued with a vengeance. He's stopped by water, the water of the Tan. The enemy plows on, intent on his death. Go, he shouts at his faithful horse. Heaven's whip like golden wind urging him on. The sound of 1,000 horsemen clattering behind him. And into the thick of it, these 2 dash like dragons. The one, born to rule the west. The other, for this dragon horse to bear him. The Tan's waters race, streaming eastwards. Dragon horse and brave warrior, ah, where are they now? I'm standing by the riverbank, perplexed. As the sun's last rays light on the hills. Was it just a dream, these 3 kingdoms? What will it be for the future? Just a dissolving memory? The Song dynasty collapsed, losing northern China to invading tribes and resettling in the south, not long after this poem was written. As a result, the conflict between the barbarian tribes of the north and those in the south and west under mainstream Chinese rule became a theme which found a focus in the historical story of the struggle between Cao Cao in the north and Xuanda in the west and in the south. The antagonism between these 2 key characters is there in the historical records, but there is no doubt that the development of stories about them through poetry, folk theater and opera from around AD 1100 onwards considerably heightened the dramatic tensions. Later, the Romance would exploit these tensions still further, using the antagonism of characters such as Xuanda and Cao Cao as a means of illuminating the whole historical period, much as Shakespeare would do with the kings and villains of his history plays. As we have seen with the inclusions in the Book of Classical Verses from great poets such as Du Fu and Su Dongpa, the 3 kingdoms makes extensive use of poems, which are scattered through the body of almost every chapter. The use of poems in classical novels is fairly typical. The Water Margin, another of the classic novels of China, also has poems scattered throughout. But what is more unusual about the 3 kingdoms, apart from the use of major poems by great poets, is the way the author introduces additional, essentially anonymous poems, often preceded by the phrase "a poet has written." These poems sound like the sort of summing up speech an actor would recite to remind the audience of what has happened so far in a play, not on the whole gems of poetry but useful encapsulations of what has just happened to whom. It is likely that these are derived from the folk plays and operas that developed in medieval China and traveled from place to place. Thus, we have historical records as the bedrock, we have the dramatic use of the material, primarily in temple or village storytelling and theater, as well as the famous verses composed by poets such as Du Fu and Su Dongpa. The third layer is the work of the author of this novel pulling it all together. That there was a novelist of considerable skill is without doubt. The Romance of the 3 Kingdoms is a magnificent work of creative writing and has enthralled readers for over 500 years. But who exactly was the author? Convention says it was the writer Luo Guanzhong. Almost nothing is known about him except that he lived somewhere between 1315 and 1400. He is first listed as the author in a 1522 edition of the novel, which contains a preface written in 1494 that mentions Luo as the author. This would put the composition of the novel somewhere between 1350 and 1380, which is almost exactly the time of the English poet and storyteller Geoffrey Chaucer, c. 1343-1400, who in a similar way took old stories, shook them around a little and created and recreated wonderful tales to enthrall audiences. However, these dates are not agreed by everyone. Some specialists prefer to date the novel to the middle of the 15th century, which would take Luo Guanzhong completely out of the picture. Whoever wrote it, in its current form, the one thing we know is that the novel dates from some point in the first 100 years or so from the beginning of the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644, and reflects a rising national pride in the unification of China. The 14th century uprising against the Mongols, whose Yuan dynasty had ruled China for nearly 100 years, was a powerful anti-foreigner and anti-northern movement launched by Chinese nationalists. There was a strong revival of interest in Chinese dynastic history when at last the empire was ruled by Chinese emperors from the late 14th century onwards. The pride felt in the rise of the Ming was to be cast down in 1644 when yet another Mongol invasion conquered the whole of China and the Manchu Qing dynasty took power. Once again northern invaders subjugated China, and once again the novel attained a sort of iconic role because it was not only about revival of the empire but also powerfully nationalistic and anti-northerner in orientation. It held out hope of a change and of Chinese domination once again. In 1911 the Qing finally fell, and the Republic came into being. In the 1920s and 1930s warlords ruled over a chaotic land, and it seemed as if the Three Kingdoms was being repeated, only this time as an epic of 7 or even 8 little kingdoms. In this context the fact that military officers on all sides, but especially in the Republican army of the Kuomintang, were recorded as studying the romance of the Three Kingdoms to help them plan military action is highly significant. But in the end it was to no avail, and in 1949 the Communist People's Republic of China was formally declared, once again uniting China under one dynasty. Today, the popularity of the Three Kingdoms is as great as it has ever been. Movies, manga books, cartoons, TV series, computer games, comic books, the Three Kingdoms story is more accessible now than ever. However, it is a vast book, just short of 1 million Chinese characters, and requires some considerable effort to read. This was why Penguin Classics asked me to produce an abridged version. An abridgment is always a challenge. What do you leave out? How do you connect the segments? But it is also exciting. The text in this book is about a third of the whole, and I have sought to ensure a flow of narrative with no breaks. In order to do this, I have simplified the background information, trimmed down the many long descriptions of battles, which are all remarkably similar, and tightened the narrative. As a result, I hope you will be able to travel the length of the novel's span in time, narrative and adventure without the risk of getting bogged down in minor details. Where a major story takes place, such as the fascinating plot by Wang Yun and his servant girl Dia Chan to destroy the dictator Dong Zhuo through romantic intrigue setting father against son, or the story of the terrible misunderstanding leading Cao Cao to kill an innocent family, I have translated the whole text. Likewise, I have fully translated major discussions, such as when Chuanda meets his future mother-in-law, who responds to his virtue with virtue of her own. I have included just over a third of the original poems, including all those by great poets such as Cao Zhi, who was the actual son of Cao Cao and a renowned 3rd century poet, and of course Su Dongpa and Du Fu, as well as those anonymous poems which shed light on a key moment in the narrative. I am grateful to poet J. Ramsey for working with me to turn my translations back into poetry. Diao Chan. This is not the first abridgment of one of the so-called 4 classic novels of China undertaken for Penguin Classics. In 1961 Penguin published the abridged edition of Wu Chenen's Journey to the West, Monkey, as it is also called in English, translated by Arthur Waley and originally published in 1942. Waley's approach was to omit many episodes, but translate those that are retained almost in full. Large as the Romance of the Three Kingdoms is in Chinese, it has serious competition from the size of the full edition of Monkey. I have adopted Waley's policy of full translation of key episodes while ensuring that the flow of the story is also retained. You will find a list of the main characters just before the text starts. See here, this will be useful, as there are lots of Chaos, Lius, Suns, Yes and others. In the Chinese text, many of the characters have several names, and I have on each occasion chosen just one, for clarity. The map will also help you follow the major events and remember where Wei is in relation to Wu and Shu. The chapter titles are essentially traditional ones. However, I have added key events, such as the death of major figures, which help us to follow the plot but which are not in the original text of the chapter titles. It has been an adventure translating and then abridging this astonishing novel. I find myself using stories from it in discussions with people because this is in the end a vast human drama about leadership, power, decline, abuse, loyalty, heroes, villains, magic and the supernatural, ghosts and virtue. It truly is one of the classics, not just of China, but of the world.